This video is sponsored by Launch Tabletop, a full-scale board game manufacturer with a print-on-demand prototyping service, Launch Lab. Hang on until the end of the video for more information and a discount code. Hello, and we're back once again with another 10 entries into my 100 lessons that I've learnt about board game design and the board game industry over 10 years or so of making games. And so I'll put them up on the screen now. These are the topics that we're going to be looking at, and as always, I haven't seen these topics yet. This is the magic of editing, that you can see hints towards those topics right now. What I've got here is a deck of cards that I've written different lessons, different truths about the board game industry on, and I'm going to reveal 10 at random and talk about those in this video. So truth number 1 is work to deadlines. So this is something that I started doing pretty early in my board game design, almost straight away really. I got involved in a local playtest group, and it was one that met up once a week. So there was always a looming deadline, and I knew that I wanted to have something ready for that meetup every single week, whether it was a new game or just a new iteration on an old game, just something, a new version of the stuff that we'd tested the previous week with some tweaks made to it, anything. But I always wanted to have at least one thing to show at that weekly design meetup. And that's a lot, because we started that way back in about 2014, I think, something like that, right up through to the pandemic in 2020. It was every single week. And practically every week I had something new to show. Now, since the pandemic, I mean, through those first couple of years of the pandemic, the meeting stopped altogether. Now it's once a month, and those deadlines are less rigid. Okay, and that makes it much harder for me to motivate myself to get on and do stuff. But Essen has always been a big deadline for me. I've always considered that meeting, that convention in October each year to be something I work towards. And I start really seriously thinking about that early in the year, maybe about sort of May, June time. I'm trying to firm up, right, what are the games that I think are going to be ready to take to Essen this year? Throughout August, I'm starting to prototype. Throughout September, I'm starting to contact publishers. But I'm constantly hitting my own deadlines that I've put in place for me. Okay, and it's similar with this YouTube channel. For a couple of years during the pandemic, I was determined that I would make one video a week, and that was a significant increase in output compared to what I'd done previously, where I might make one video every few months. Over recent months, I just haven't had the time to be making a video each week, so I've had to pull back. But there's still always that sort of internal pressure. I need to constantly be doing new stuff. If I didn't have that pressure, then I don't think anything would happen at all. Value your playtesters. They're giving up their time to play your game, which is half-baked. I mean, literally half-baked. It's unfinished. And that's not always fun. I don't always relish the idea of playing somebody else's unfinished design, particularly if it's going to take a couple of hours to play, complex rules, it's all looking a little bit rough and ragged. It's not always the most appealing prospect. But your playtesters are doing that willingly, and they're doing that for many different reasons, I guess. They're either doing it because they want you to playtest their game, or they're doing it because they're interested in the game design process, or they're doing it just to be helpful, or maybe they just really like you. Maybe they've played some of your other games and they think this one, it might be a good opportunity to do something fun. But more often than not, these playtests aren't smooth games and smooth experiences. Your playtesters are giving up a lot, and they're not being paid for it, particularly if they're doing blind tests where they're learning the game from your written rules. That can be a real chore. So value your playtesters, look after them, do what you can, whether that's, I don't know, make them some dinner, or buy them a drink, or buy them a meal, or whatever it is, or play their game. Okay, but value them. Okay, they might be giving you negative feedback, they might be telling you things you really don't want to hear. Nonetheless, they are valuable to you, and they don't get much in the way of reward. So look after your playtesters. Theme and mechanisms inform each other. Neither comes first. So this one is in answer to the very common question that you hear from new designers, and it gets shared on forums online about game design. What do you do first? Do you design the theme first or the mechanisms first? Or it may not come from design circles. It may be something that you're asked by a media content creator or something like that when they're interviewing you as a designer. So what comes first? What's in your design process? Is it theme first or mechanisms first? And I think for the majority of us, it's neither. It's either one of them, both of them at the same time. If you start with a theme, very quickly you're going to be thinking about which mechanisms work for that theme, which simulate that environment, and so on. And so those mechanisms are going to come in and they're going to inform the way that the theme changes and adapts as you realise there are certain things that you can't do within the abstractions of a board game. You might have to shift your theme to fit your mechanisms. But equally, if you have a really strong mechanical idea, a game system, you're going to want to think what sort of theme might fit that system really, really early. And in this case, the theme will definitely shift the way you use those mechanisms, because it'll suggest new ideas for you. And you're thinking, well, in this setting, in this world, I really need this particular aspect to feature. How can I represent that mechanically? So the two things just inform each other and help each other along the way. If you come up with a fully developed world before you even come up with any mechanisms, then I think you're going to end up with something really disjointed, and vice versa. If you come up with something entirely mechanical, yes, you can paste a theme over it, and that's sort of okay because we have lots of abstract games out there and they can be really, really popular. But even better if the two things mesh together well. It also makes the game much, much easier to learn if the theme makes sense with the mechanisms, so everything becomes a lot more intuitive. It just feels right that the game would work in this way, in that world that you've chosen. Publishers rush rulebooks. I really think this is the case. I think the rulebook is the final thing that's done in the process. And usually there's a big rush at the end of development of a game. I'm very frequently told your game will be out for Christmas, or your game will be out for Essen, Spiel, and then the last month or so before Christmas or Essen Spiel, you're thinking, I'm not sure it's going to make it, and inevitably it doesn't. It's then pushed back to the spring of the following year for the toy fairs, Nuremberg, and so on. Things get rushed at the end, and the rulebook is never ready, right? The rulebook always seems to be the final thing. It's the last thing I see, and often I see it at the point where there's very little I can do about it. It's already been translated into 7 different languages before I get to proofread it, and then if I find problems in the English language version, I've no idea whether those problems, well, they will have been translated into the foreign language editions, but I can't check the foreign language editions because I don't speak all of those languages. It gets rushed. The chance of any blind testing to be going on with that rulebook, I think it's minimal in a lot of cases. When at the publisher's level, they produce the rulebook. If that rulebook is going to print, getting shared on Board Game Geek or on their personal websites, the publishers' websites, then it's very unlikely that anyone's actually sitting down with that rulebook and learning the game from it afresh, without having seen it before. So I think this is why we end up with some games with terrible rulebooks. And it's so sad because it can sink a game. I mean, if you can't learn the game, it's just going to stay on people's shelves. They might buy it because of a bit of buzz or because of a pretty cover, some pretty components, a nice central component or something like that. But if they can't play it, it's going to remain on the shelf. And that kills your word of mouth. It kills any sort of chance of any awards or anything like that, and the game will ultimately sink. So I think really publishers need to be pushing their rulebooks much earlier in the chain of events of developing these games. So keep an eye on that as a designer. I'm not sure there's that much you can do about it, but certainly, you could ask every now and then, how's the rulebook coming on? Have you got a rulebook to share with me? Could I proofread the rulebook? And certainly make your suggestions. I found that where it's been possible, my suggestions have been incorporated into rulebooks if I've had a chance to see it before it goes to print. Playtesters come in many forms: designer, expert, casual. Yeah, we talk about playtesters as if they're one thing, don't we? And they're really not. There's 3 different types here. So often you're going to be playtesting with, probably most commonly with experts. Okay, most commonly you're going to have access to a gaming group that's full of people who play a lot of board games, and those might be the people you talk into playing your prototype game. They know a lot. Okay, they know all the jargon. You can use shortcuts to teach them the game. If you tell them it's a deck building game, they're, oh fine, yeah, you don't need to explain what deck building is. So they don't really represent the mass market. They represent the hobby market. And the majority of people don't fall into that category. They're the ones that you tend to have the most access to if you yourself are a gamer. So it's great, okay? It's great to get a feel for it because they understand the industry a bit better than the majority of purchasers. But it's limited in terms of they are not going to be the majority of people who buy your game. The casual audience is the majority. Okay, so the casual audience is the people who pick it up and they've never played a deck building game before. They've never played a push your luck game before or a trick taking game, and you've got to explain it to them from scratch. And your game really needs to sing even in that environment. So for example, my game Pikoko is a trick taking game where you can't see your own cards. Okay, nice and simple concept if you're an expert. Because if you're an expert, I don't need to explain to you how to play trick taking games. I just need to explain to you what's different about my one. Okay, in my trick-taking game, you don't see your own cards and you place bets on how many tricks you think each player is going to win. What I found when demoing that game at conventions, as opposed to playing with experts, was I would meet people all the time who'd never played a trick-taking game. And now, teaching the rules takes twice as long. The game is twice as complex as I intended it to be. So you need to try things out with casual players and see how they get on with your game, not just with the experts. And then the other group, which again you probably have more access to than you do casual players, is designers. And playtesting with designers is a very different experience because designers will do everything they can to fix your game. Okay, if they find something that's not fun, they're going to start to give you their opinions about why it's not fun, what you could do differently. They're going to reach into their sort of catalogue of past experiences, their vocabulary of game mechanisms, and start to present you with ideas about how you could change your game, and you're not necessarily going to know which one to follow. It's an extremely valuable experience playtesting with designers because they can help you fix stuff that you hadn't sort of worked out yourself, but they can also lead you down a path you never wanted to go down. Okay, so just recognize that playtesting with different groups is particularly valuable, and the limitations of each individual group is important to understand so that you make sure you really get a breadth of different type of playtester. Publishers are frequently poor communicators. Yeah, I mean, well, we're all frequently poor communicators, aren't we? And publishers are no different. I've found a lot over the years that publishers will sometimes be extremely communicative and then that same publisher will go quiet, sometimes for months at a time, and then they're back in communication. And it depends on what's going on in their business, how busy they are, how important your project is to them at that particular moment in time. But it can be extremely frustrating for a designer, particularly when you're in a totally different country and you've got no idea what's going on with the progress on your game, and you're emailing and sometimes the emails aren't even getting answered. That's not to even mention that initial contact where you're sending them details of your game with the hope they might take it on. In that instance, often you get no response whatsoever. And I don't blame the publishers for that, because why should they respond? It's a totally unsolicited offer. They didn't invite your offer, so they have no duty to respond to you. But it does get frustrating when you've met with a publisher, they've agreed to take a look at your game, to test it, and then you can't get a response. Maybe you've even given them a prototype and you're getting nowhere. You're getting nothing back from them, and ultimately at a certain point you have to give up. You don't want to pester people by constantly sending them messages. You don't want to seem like a pest, but there are certain things that are important, like I don't know, getting paid, or getting your designer copies, or you know, knowing when the game is likely to release and when it's likely to release in different countries, and who their publishing partners are. If it's going to be available at a particular convention that you're going to be attending. And sometimes it can be very difficult to get answers to those things. So I wouldn't be afraid of asking the questions and putting a little bit of pressure if you've got an arrangement with that publisher. Clearly, if you're sending something unsolicited, I think really all you can do is chase that up maybe once, perhaps twice, but I don't think you can really keep on the publisher's case when they've got no obligation to you at all. But certainly if you're under contract with somebody, you want to know what's going on, and publishers are not always the best at communicating that to you. Pitch meetings can happen anywhere. I mean, I don't know how you imagine, if you've never had a pitch meeting, I don't know if you imagine what a pitch meeting might look like. Okay, I've had pitch meetings sat on the floor outside the toilet. Okay, you go to meet the publisher, they haven't got a little office space, they've barely got any table space. So they say, come on, let's go and find an empty space somewhere in this convention. Well, in Essenspiel, there are no empty spaces in that convention, unless you just go and find a corner somewhere and sit on the floor. And so that's what you might end up doing with the publisher and showing them your game on the floor. You might find that you're finding an eating space and everyone's munching on burgers around you or currywurst around you while you're showing your game to the publisher and everyone's listening in. You might find you're showing it on the table that they're using to demo their games that are for sale, and that the convention goers are stopping by the table and saying, oh, what's this game? Can you demonstrate it to us? And you're having to say, oh, sorry, no, we're having a meeting. This is just a prototype. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you might find that your meeting is outside of the convention hall. It's in another room, down another corridor, even in a different building. You might have to walk down the road. You get into this posh building with, hospitality, and there's coffee and there's biscuits and there's sofas, and you get to wait. When you get ushered along by somebody who's supporting them, like a PA or whatever, you're guided into this posh room where you sit down with a man in a suit or a woman in a suit, and you have these very formal sort of meetings. It can be all of those things, or none of them. It could be a virtual meeting, of course, that you have on your computer. I think the key thing to remember is these publishers are human beings, and these companies are vastly different in scale. Even some of the really, really successful companies, the ones that we all know the names of, some of them just have 2 or 3 people working there, and their convention space, their booth is tiny, even though they're a really impactful publisher. So you just got to deal with it on the fly. Your pitch meeting, be ready to deal with it wherever it is. And that can be difficult if you've got a massive, sprawling, epic Euro game, and now you're having to fit it into a tiny little space in order to demonstrate it. But be adaptable, be flexible. This is a chance to make a good impression. Don't design late at night. Do it in the morning. Perhaps this is a personal one for me, but if I design into the evening, even into the early evening really, certainly into the late evening, I can't sleep. All I've got going around in my head is that design. Or maybe I managed to get to sleep, but then I'm awake at 3 in the morning and I'm thinking about the game and I'm solving problems and I want to write it down, and before you know it, I cannot get back to sleep. You need, particularly if you're doing this frequently, if you're designing day in, day out, you need to get some sleep. It's important that you sleep, and you sleep well. And I think switching off for that sort of hour and a half or so before you go to bed, I try and avoid screens and all that sort of thing. I fail all the time, but I try. You want to avoid that blue light. You certainly don't want to be doing anything that's particularly stimulating, so that you can get to sleep and you get into that sort of that circadian rhythm, get those cycles in, so that then when you're awake in the morning, you're ready to start designing. And actually, I think for a lot of us, I'm not saying it's for everybody, but I'm sure I've read research which has said that for the majority of us, that early morning period is our most productive. Okay, so getting up early and getting designing, but not at 3 in the morning. Okay, you want to get some decent sleep and then getting up early and doing the work then, if it's possible. And I know that means completely rearranging your life, because most of us are doing this as a second job, aren't we? So most of us have to go to work, okay? But trying to make sure that you've got room in your schedule which still allows you to get, I don't know how many cycles of sleep, a cycle being an hour and a half, right? So I guess most of us need 5 cycles, maybe some of us only need 4. I doubt many people genuinely need less than that. But you've got to fit those cycles in and do the work around your day job. And it doesn't all necessarily fit. But don't disturb your sleep by overstimulating with game design before you go to bed. Know your audience and what they need. Okay, so this one really could just say empathy. And I think that is at the core of it. That is the number one thing that I've been trying to press over the last couple of years on this channel, is that game design should not always just be about experimentation and inspiration. It should be about looking at the people out there and what do they want? Okay, what is needed right now in the industry? What's missing? What are people crying out for? Make that. Okay, or don't, maybe just make what you want. Don't worry about your audience. And that's fine. No harm in doing that whatsoever. But if you want to have commercial success, that's probably not going to get you there. I would say from the very earliest stage, when you first got those ideas floating about in your mind, maybe that is at 3 o'clock in the morning, I would ask yourself quite early on, is this a concept that is ever going to get anywhere commercially? If it's not, maybe you make it anyway for the pleasure of it. But if you decide at that early stage, do you know what, I love this concept, but I don't see it going anywhere, well, maybe write it down somewhere in a notebook, put it to one side to come back to later, but spend your time on something which is likely to generate you a little bit more success. Okay, that's assuming that you've got ideas coming thick and fast. Of course, if you've got one idea and you absolutely love it, well, crack on, get on with it, take your chance. But if you want commercial success, I think you've got to bring the audience in there really early and make sure you're designing something that people actually want or need. A big publisher does not equal big success. Oh yeah, this was really one of the first tips that I was told when I first started thinking about professionally publishing my games, getting them made by publishers. I was, super excited to be getting meetings with, the publishers that you can see behind me here, the big names in the industry. If I could get a meeting with Hasbro or Ravensburger or something like that, that would have been like a dream come true to me. I would have thought, oh, I've made it. But what you actually discover is that when you publish games with companies that produce a lot of games, and they might be producing them in large numbers, it probably means your game is not going to get the love and attention that it really deserves. Your game will be one of many. And at some point in that year or 2-year process of producing your game, the publisher's going to make a decision. And I don't know whether it's a conscious decision, whether it's a specific strategic decision, or whether it happens somewhere in their subconscious. But they might make the decision, well, your game is a bit of noise in the system. It's one of the things that will go in the catalogue, but it's not going to be on the front page. It's not going to be the thing they push. It's not going to be on the big demo table. It's not going to have posters. It's not going to have banners. They're not going to produce loads of review copies. They're not going to go out seeking massive distribution partners and deals and things like that, because the publisher's going to really focus in on the thing that they're getting the most attention and buzz for. Whereas if you pitch your game to a publisher who's only making a couple of games a year and they go for it, and maybe they're not the biggest publisher in the world, maybe they're really tiny, maybe it's only their second or third game, or even their first, well, they're going to love your game. That's going to be their whole focus. They're going to communicate with you, they're going to work with you, hopefully, and they're going to really, really try to make it the best it can possibly be. Okay, it will have posters, it will have banners, it will get reviews. Okay, they're going to be pushing it all the way. Now, whether that genuinely generates more sales than the big company, it could do, but even if it doesn't, you're likely to have a more positive experience from the whole thing. And I think genuinely good games tend to rise up even with those small publishers. If you've got a really good game with a small publisher, other partners are going to notice it, right? If you're getting good reviews, you're getting some good buzz, other partners are going to start to notice. They're going to say, can I bring that game into my catalogue for this particular region of the world? Or can we distribute this game together so that I can have my logo on the box? So I think, yeah, small games with small publishers can get picked up by bigger publishers further down the line. And maybe going with the big publisher where your game might get lost, or maybe they don't even produce it at all once you've signed that contract, that's not always the big win that it at first seems. Okay, so there's another 10. That was numbers 50 through to 41. So we'll be doing another 10 over the coming days, well, another 40 over the coming days, until we get to the end of this 100 lessons. So until next time, all the best. Did you know that project turnaround time is 7 to 10 business days by default? And you don't need to pay extra to get your game made this quickly with LaunchLab. If you need to get your prototypes made quickly, visit launchtabletop.com and use the code AdminWales for a 20% discount on your order.